Link, imagine a day when the future of all Western civilization depended on the waves of the Mediterranean Sea. A day when the greatest empire in the known world sent its unbeatable navy to destroy Christian resistance once and for all. A day when a new type of weapon would forever change naval warfare. This is the story of the Battle of Lepanto, fought on October 7, 1571, and of the secret weapon that decided the fate of millions. If you enjoy exciting stories about military strategy, new technology, and important moments in history, subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. To fully understand what happened on that important day in the Gulf of Patras, we need to go back several decades and understand the context of a world on the edge of collapse. The 16th century was a time of amazing change where empires fought in battles that redrew borders, cultures, and the very path of human history. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Selim II had become the most feared force in the known world. His armies had conquered Constantinople in 1453, ending 1,000 years of Byzantine history and opening the door to unstoppable expansion. From that moment on, the Ottomans knew no limits. They marched across Eastern Europe, conquered Hungary, surrounded Vienna, dominated North Africa, and turned the Mediterranean into what many now called a Turkish lake. The Ottoman fleet was the perfect example of sea power. Their galleys, long, narrow ships moved mainly by oars, glided through the waters with amazing speed. Each galley carried hundreds of oarsmen, many of them Christian slaves captured in previous battles, forced to live a terrible life in the lower parts of the ships. Above them, elite soldiers known as janissaries prepared for the hand-to-hand fighting that always followed every naval collision. The Ottoman strategy was simple, but terribly effective. Their galleys sped toward the enemy using the power of hundreds of oars rowing together. Upon impact, a bronze spike on the ship's front pierced the enemy's hull while grappling hooks locked the two ships together. Then the true horror began. Janissaries armed with scimitars, bows, and arquebuses swarmed the enemy decks in endless waves. It was a form of warfare the Ottomans had perfected over generations, and few forces in the world could withstand it. But Ottoman rule was not limited to military strength alone. They had an incredibly efficient government machine capable of gathering resources from 3 continents. Their shipyards in Istanbul could build a complete galley in a matter of days. Their trade routes connected Asia to Europe, bringing unimaginable riches that paid for ever more ambitious expansions. Sultan Selim II, while lacking the military genius of his father, Suleiman the Magnificent, inherited a perfectly working war machine, eager for further conquest. Meanwhile, Christian Europe found itself in a desperate situation. The nations that should have united against a common enemy were deeply divided. The Protestant Reformation had split Christendom, creating rivalries that sometimes seemed stronger than the conflict with Islam itself. France, though Catholic, kept practical alliances with the Ottomans to weaken its Habsburg rivals. England was more concerned with its own internal affairs and the growing Spanish threat than with events in the distant Mediterranean. Only a few powers remained alert in the face of the Ottoman advance. Philip II of Spain, which had inherited an empire where the sun never set, understood that its control over the Mediterranean was at stake. The Republic of Venice, the commercial jewel of the Adriatic, saw its trade routes being strangled one by one. The Papal States under Pope Pius V recognized that Rome itself could be threatened if the Ottomans were not stopped. The trigger for the final battle came with the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus. The island, which had been a Venetian stronghold for nearly a century, fell after a brutal siege lasting more than a year. Venetian resistance was heroic but hopeless. When the capital Famagusta finally surrendered in August 1571, the Venetian commander Marcantonio Bragadin was promised safe passage. Instead, he was subjected to unimaginable torture and finally flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and displayed as a trophy in Istanbul. This act of cruelty shocked all of Europe and finally provided the push for a Christian alliance. Pope Pius V, a man of iron determination and smart political vision, worked tirelessly to create a seemingly impossible alliance. He needed to unite Venice, which had lost Cyprus and demanded revenge, with Spain, which viewed the Venetians as annoying commercial competitors. He needed to include the Papal States, Genoa, Savoy, and the Orders of Malta and the Knights of St. Stephen. Each of these powers had its own goals, its own interests, and its own mutual distrust. Through a combination of skillful diplomacy, passionate religious appeals, and promises of material benefits, the Pope achieved what many considered impossible. In May of 1571, the Holy League was born, a coalition of Christian states committed to stopping the Ottoman advance. The terms of the alliance specified that each member would contribute ships, men, and resources. Spain would provide the bulk of the fleet and financing. Venice would bring its unmatched naval expertise, and the Pope would serve as a mediator and spiritual unifying force. To command this Christian armada, a young man was chosen, already surrounded by the aura of legend. Don Juan of Austria was only 24 years old, but his name was already spoken with reverence throughout Europe. The illegitimate son of Emperor Charles V and half-brother of King Philip II of Spain, Don Juan had grown up far from the courts, shielded from political intrigue, until his brother finally recognized him and brought him to the center of power. Don Juan had proven his military worth by putting down the Moorish rebellion in Granada, demonstrating not only personal courage but also tactical skill and the ability to inspire fierce loyalty in his men. He was charismatic, handsome, cultured, and ambitious. Some said he dreamed of conquering Constantinople and restoring the ancient Byzantine Empire under his own rule. Others whispered that he aspired to be king of some newly conquered kingdom. But what no one questioned was his bravery and absolute determination. The Holy League fleet began gathering in Messina, Sicily, during the summer of 1571. It was a logistical feat of amazing proportions. Ships arrived from all over the western Mediterranean, each bringing not only soldiers and sailors, but also supplies, weapons, ammunition, and the complex chains of command that reflected the alliance's political tensions. There were Venetian galleys, sleek and swift, painted in the colors of the Republic of St. Mark. There were Spanish galleons, larger and more heavily armed. There were vessels from Genoa, the Papal States, Malta, and dozens of other smaller principalities. Among these ships was something new, something few had seen before, and which most veteran commanders viewed with deep skepticism. These were the galleasses, vessels that represented a radical evolution in naval design. While traditional galleys were low, narrow, and relied primarily on their speed and maneuverability, galleasses were true monsters of the sea. They were larger, taller, with imposing forecastles, and carried a quantity of artillery that would have been impossible on a regular galley. The Venetians, always the Mediterranean's most daring naval innovators, had developed this concept through decades of experimentation. A typical galleass measured over 40 meters in length and displaced several hundred tons. Its hull was reinforced to withstand the weight and recoil of dozens of cannons. At the bow, it mounted heavy artillery pieces capable of firing projectiles weighing 20 kilograms or more at considerable distances. Alongside, rows of smaller cannons created a devastating field of fire. But the true revolution lay not only in the number of guns but in the combat philosophy they represented. For centuries, Mediterranean naval warfare had been essentially an infantry battle fought on floating platforms. The goal was to get close, board, and engage in close combat. Artillery existed, but it was seen primarily as a support for the boarding maneuver, not as the deciding weapon in itself. Galleasses proposed something completely different, destroying the enemy from a distance before they could even get close enough to board. This idea met with considerable resistance. Veteran commanders who had spent decades perfecting the art of galley warfare viewed galleasses as clumsy oddities. They were slow, difficult to maneuver, and dependent on the wind for effective movement in a battle that would be decided by speed and agility. Skeptics argued these floating fortresses would be more of a hindrance than an asset. Some even suggested they would be sitting ducks, too big to lose, too slow to escape. Don Juan of Austria, however, saw something different. He recognized that while galleasses could not pursue the enemy, they could form anchor points in a battle line, creating impossible kill zones for any galley attempting to advance. He decided to include 6 Venetian galleasses into his battle formation, a decision that would prove absolutely crucial. While the Christian fleet was preparing in Messina, on the opposite side of the Mediterranean, another impressive force was gathering. Muezzin Zad Ali Pasha, the Supreme Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, had received direct orders from the Sultan. Destroy the Christian fleet once and for all, and pave the way for an invasion of southern Italy. Ali Pasha was an experienced and respected commander, one of the few admirals who had survived the frequent purges of the Ottoman court. He commanded a fleet of nearly 300 galleys, each manned by veteran fighters and slaves conditioned to the brutal rhythm of the oars. Ottoman confidence bordered on arrogance. They had defeated Christian fleets repeatedly over the previous decades. Their most recent victory in Cyprus had been complete and crushing. They believed, with apparent reason, that the Holy League fleet would simply be another addition to their long list of conquests. Some Ottoman commanders were already openly discussing what they would do after victory. Which Italian cities to attack first? How much territory could be added to the empire? In September of 1571, the Holy League fleet finally set sail from Messina. It was a spectacular sight that would have amazed any observer. More than 200 galleys and galleons sailed in formation, their colorful sails creating a multicolored carpet over the blue waters of the Mediterranean. Religious banners fluttered from every mast. Golden crosses gleamed in the sun, and the sound of drums and commands echoed across the waves. Aboard these vessels traveled more than 80,000 men, including some of the fiercest soldiers in Europe. Among these soldiers was Miguel de Cervantes, the future author of Don Quixote, then a young common soldier serving in a Spanish company. He was sick with a fever on the day of the battle, but refused to remain below deck, insisting on fighting despite his weakened condition. His courage would cost him dearly. He would receive 3 arquebus wounds, one of which would leave his left hand permanently paralyzed. But he would survive to write about that glorious day. The fleet sailed east across the Adriatic, searching for the Ottoman fleet. Anxiety grew with each passing day. Contradictory rumors arrived constantly. Some said the Ottomans had retreated to Istanbul for the winter. Others claimed they were nearby, waiting in some hidden bay to prepare an ambush. Don Juan maintained iron discipline, but even he began to wonder if there would actually be a battle that year. Then, on the morning of October 7th, as the Christian fleet sailed close to the western coast of Greece, observers at the top of the mast shouted the warning everyone had both expected and feared: sails on the horizon. Many sails. The Ottoman fleet had been found, or perhaps more accurately, it had found the Christian fleet. The confrontation that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean was about to begin. The two fleets sighted each other at dawn, near the mouth of the Gulf of Patras, near the city of Lepanto. The scenery was appropriately dramatic. The mountains of Greece rose majestically to the north, their slopes still covered in morning mist. The sea was relatively calm, with only a gentle breeze from the west. These would be ideal conditions for a galley battle where maneuver and speed would make all the difference. Don Juan immediately called his top commanders for a final war conference. Tension was in the air, not only because of the approaching battle, but also because the Venetian and Spanish commanders still had mutual distrust. The Venetians, who had lost Cyprus and thousands of their citizens, wanted immediate and total revenge. The more cautious Spanish remembered that keeping the fleet safe was as important as winning the battle. Don Juan needed to balance these conflicting priorities while preparing a combat strategy. The battle formation was carefully planned. The Christian fleet would be organized into 3 main divisions, extending in a line about 3 miles wide. Don Juan would personally command the center division aboard the Royal Galley, a magnificent vessel decorated with gold and crimson silk. To his right, commanding the southern wing, would be Giovanni Andrea Doria, one of the fleet's most experienced admirals. commander of the Genoese galleys. To his left, commanding the northern wing, would be Agostino Barbaro, a Venetian admiral determined to avenge the loss of Cyprus. And then there were the galleasses. Don Juan made the crucial decision to position these 6 vessels at the head of the Christian battle line, 2 opposite each division. They were to serve as a first line of defense, absorbing and disrupting the initial Ottoman attack. It was a risky strategy. If the galleasses failed to slow the enemy advance, they would simply become obstacles for the Christian fleet itself. But if they performed as planned, they could break the momentum of the Ottoman charge before it even began. On the Ottoman side, Ali Pasha also organized his fleet into 3 divisions. He held a considerable numerical advantage with some 300 galleys against approximately 208 Christian vessels. His strategy was classic and time-tested. Advance quickly, use numerical superiority to surround the wings of the Christian fleet, and then converge on the center in a devastating pincer movement. It was the same tactic that had destroyed countless Christian fleets before. Commanding the Ottoman right wing was Mehmed Sirocco, an experienced commander who knew Greek waters like no other. Commanding the left wing was Uluç Ali, an Italian renegade who had converted to Islam and become one of the most feared corsairs in the Mediterranean. Uluç Ali was known for his cunning and ruthlessness in equal measure. He had begun his career as a fisherman, was captured by Barbary pirates, converted, and rose through the ranks to become one of the most successful admirals in the Ottoman fleet. By noon, both fleets were ready. The moment was charged with historical importance that went beyond the battle itself. It was a clash of civilizations, religions, and fundamentally different worldviews. Both sides believed they were fighting not just for territory or political power, but for the very survival of their way of life. Don Juan, in a gesture that would become legendary, ordered a large crucifix to be raised on the mast of his galley. He then traveled the fleet in a small boat, visiting each division, speaking to commanders and common soldiers, inspiring them with words of encouragement, and reminding them of what was at stake. He is said to have told the men that they fought not merely for glory or plunder, but for the freedom of their families, the safety of their homes, and the preservation of their faith. On the Ottoman side, Ali Pasha issued his own words of encouragement. He reminded his men of the countless victories they had won, of the weakness and division of the Christians, and of the certainty of their victory. He promised riches, slaves, and eternal glory to those who fought well. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops, beat their weapons against their shields in a deafening rhythm, creating a sound that seemed to make the sea itself shake. Then, around 12:30, the order was given. The Ottoman galleys began to advance, their oars striking the water in perfect rhythm. It was a sight both beautiful and terrifying. Hundreds of vessels moving as a single organism, their sharp prows cutting through the waves, their green banners fluttering in the wind. The sound was deafening, the beating of drums, the shouts of the rowers, the creaking of wood under extreme strain. The Christian fleet remained in its formation, waiting. This was the most difficult part of any battle, the moment of uncertainty before contact, when each man was alone with his thoughts and fears. Many prayed, some aloud, others silently. Priests moved among the men, offering final absolution. Commanders checked their weapons for the 100th time. And then, when the Ottoman galleys in the vanguard reached about 1,000 meters, the galleasses opened fire. The effect was devastating and completely unexpected for the Ottomans. The heavy cannons on the galleasses' bows fired almost at the same time, creating a wall of fire and smoke. 20-kilogram iron shells flew through the air at terrifying speeds, striking the Ottoman galleys leading the attack. What followed was carnage. The cannonballs striking a galley packed with men not only pierced the hull, but continued their path through entire rows of soldiers and oarsmen, turning flesh and bone into a red mist. Splinters of wood became secondary projectiles as deadly as the bullets themselves. Oars were ripped off, throwing their operators overboard or crushing them against the benches. Within minutes, several Ottoman galleys in the vanguard were turned into floating wreckage. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. The Ottomans had expected a battle in the traditional style. They had planned to quickly approach, board, and win through superior hand-to-hand combat. No one had prepared for this kind of concentrated artillery fire. The galleys at the front of the formation tried to avoid it, creating confusion in the ranks behind them. The Ottoman formation, which should have been a powerful spear piercing the Christian center, began to break apart even before the actual fighting began. But the Ottomans were seasoned warriors. They would not give up easily. They regrouped and continued their advance, their galleys accelerating as fast as they could, trying to get past the galleasses before they could reload and fire again. It was a desperate race, and many succeeded. The galleasses, for all their firepower, were slow to reload and had limited fields of fire. Dozens of Ottoman galleys passed them by and crashed into the main Christian line. The clash was titanic. Wood collided with wood with a crash that could be heard for miles. Spikes pierced hulls, grappling hooks pinned vessels together, and thousands of men threw themselves into mortal combat. In the center of the line, Don Juan's galley collided directly with Ali Pasha's galley. It was as if fate itself had arranged this duel between the two supreme commanders. What followed on the royal galley was one of the fiercest battles ever recorded. Ottoman janissaries, the finest soldiers in their empire, faced the Spanish tercios, the most feared infantry in Europe. Arquebuses fired at close range. Scimitars clashed against swords. Men fought and died in such cramped quarters that the dead remained standing, held up by the pressure of the surrounding bodies. Don Juan fought personally, his sword stained with blood, inspiring his men by example. For 3 hours the battle swung back and forth. The Ottomans, with their characteristic ferocity, managed to briefly capture the forecastle of the royal galley. For terrifying moments it seemed as if Don Juan would be captured or killed. But reinforcements arrived from neighboring galleys, and the Christians regained the lost ground. Arquebuses in the battle turrets fired down upon the crowded deck, each shot felling men like grains of wheat under a sickle. On the wings, equally fierce battles raged. On the north wing, Agostino Barbaro led his Venetians against Mehmed Scirocco. The Venetians fought with particular fury, remembering Cyprus and the fate of Marcantonio Bragadin. Barbaro was wounded early in the battle by an arrow that pierced his eye, but he refused to leave the deck, continuing to command while bleeding heavily. Eventually, the Venetian wing began to gain the upper hand. The Ottoman galleys, surprised by the intensity of the resistance, began to retreat. On the southern wing, however, the situation was different. Uluc Ali, the Italian renegade, showed why he was considered one of the most cunning commanders in the Mediterranean. Realizing that the frontal attack was failing, he executed a daring flanking maneuver. His galleys circled the southern end of the Christian line, threatening to surround the entire formation. Giovanni Andrea Doria, commanding the southern Christian wing, was forced to extend his line to avoid being flanked, creating dangerous gaps in the formation. Uluc Ali exploited these gaps ruthlessly. His galleys broke through the Christian line, causing chaos and confusion. He managed to capture the flagship galley of the Order of Malta, killed its commander, and tore down the order's standard as a trophy. For a moment it seemed as if the Christian southern flank might collapse completely, endangering the entire fleet. But it was at this critical moment that the true genius of Don Juan's formation revealed itself. He had kept a reserve of galleys behind the main line, including some of the most powerful Spanish and Venetian galleys. When the danger on the southern wing became apparent, he sent this reserve to stabilize the situation. Commanded by Alvaro de Bazan, Marquis of Santa Cruz, these galleys counterattacked with devastating force, pushing Uluc Ali's galleys back and restoring the Christian line. In the center, the battle on the royal galley finally reached its climax. Ali Pasha, the Ottoman supreme commander, was fighting personally on the bow of his galley when an arquebus shot struck him. He fell mortally wounded. Christian soldiers immediately rushed him, and within moments his head was cut off and raised on a spear. A scream of horror ran through the Ottoman fleet when they saw their dead commander. In contrast, the Christians let out a roar of triumph that seemed to make the waters tremble. Ali Pasha's death marked the decisive turning point. The Sultan's standard, which had flown proudly from the mast of his galley, was torn down and replaced by the standard of the Holy League. This symbolic act had a devastating psychological effect. Ottoman galleys that had still been fighting fiercely moments before began to waver. Commanders who had confidently pressed forward with attacks began to consider retreat, and then the tide of battle turned decisively. The Ottoman formation, which had already been disrupted by galleass fire earlier in the battle, began to fall apart completely. Galleys tried to flee, but many were so tangled with Christian vessels that escape was impossible. Others managed to free themselves but found there was nowhere to go. The bay was surrounded on 3 sides by land, and the Christian fleet blocked the only exit to the open sea. What followed was more of an execution than a battle. Ottoman galleys were hunted down and destroyed one by one. Some ran aground on the coast in desperate attempts to allow their crews to escape by land. Others were surrounded and forced to surrender after brief but fierce fighting. The sea ran red with blood and the surface was covered with wreckage, bodies, and desperate men trying to swim to safety. By late afternoon, the Battle of Lepanto was essentially over. Of the nearly 300 galleys Ali Pasha had commanded that morning, more than 200 had been destroyed or captured. Some 30,000 Ottomans were dead, and another 8,000 had been captured. Most importantly, 15,000 Christians who had been slaves on the Ottoman galleys were freed, many of them chained to the oars for years or even decades. Christian losses, though significant, were much smaller, some 8,000 dead, and perhaps twice that number wounded. 13 galleys had been lost. It was a crushing victory by any measure. The invincibility of the Ottoman fleet, which had been taken for granted for generations, had been decisively shattered in a single afternoon of fighting. As the sun set over the Gulf of Patras, lighting up the floating wreckage with a golden and red light, Don Juan toured the battlefield. He visited the wounded, comforted the dying, and thanked the survivors. The magnitude of what had been achieved was beginning to become clear. This was not just another naval victory. It was a historic turning point. The secret weapon that had been so crucial to this victory was now clear to all. It wasn't just the galleasses themselves, though their importance could not be denied. It was the revolutionary concept they represented, the power of naval artillery as a deciding weapon, not merely as support for boarding tactics. The 6 Venetian galleasses had fundamentally changed the dynamics of the battle from the opening minutes. Their concentrated fire had destroyed or damaged dozens of Ottoman galleys before they could even engage in close combat. More importantly, they had broken the psychological momentum of the Ottoman attack. The Turkish commanders, used to sprinting toward enemy lines, found themselves sailing through a field of destruction before even reaching their targets. This initial disruption created the hesitation and confusion that allowed the Christian fleet to gain the initial advantage. But the story of Lepanto's secret weapon goes far beyond the galleasses themselves. It was also about the broader transformation of naval warfare that was taking place at that historical moment. For centuries, maritime combat in the Mediterranean had essentially been an extension of land warfare, with ships serving as transport platforms for soldiers who then fought in close combat. The true innovation at Lepanto was the recognition that the ship itself, armed with powerful artillery, could be the deciding weapon. This transformation didn't happen overnight. The Venetians had experimented with naval artillery for decades, trying different configurations, different gun sizes, and different firing platform arrangements. The galleasses that fought at Lepanto were the result of generations of technical refinement and strategic thinking. They represented a massive investment not only in material resources, but also in new naval doctrine. A galleass's crew was fundamentally different from that of a traditional galley. While a galley required hundreds of oarsmen but relatively few gunners, a galleass reversed this ratio. It required trained gunners capable of operating complex cannons under the chaotic conditions of combat. It required officers who understood ballistics, range, ammunition type, and reload time. It was a new kind of naval warfare that required a new kind of sailor. The Ottomans, for all their military prowess, had been slower to adopt these innovations. Their naval tradition was deeply rooted in galley tactics, and these tactics had worked magnificently for generations. Why change a winning formula? This reluctance to innovate, this reliance on time-tested methods, ultimately cost them dearly at Lepanto. In the weeks after the battle, as the Holy League fleet regrouped and repaired its damage, the full magnitude of the victory began to sink in. Messengers raced across Europe bearing news that seemed too good to be true. The invincible Ottoman fleet had been destroyed. The Islamic advance in the Mediterranean had been stopped. Christendom had won its greatest naval victory in generations. The celebration was explosive. Church bells rang in every Christian city. Processions of thanksgiving filled the streets. Pope Pius V, who had worked so tirelessly to create the Holy League, fell to his knees in prayer upon hearing the news. He attributed the victory to divine intervention and established October 7th as the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary in commemoration. In Venice, the celebration lasted for days, with fireworks lighting up the night sky and wine flowing freely in the squares. Don Juan of Austria instantly became Europe's most celebrated hero. At 24, he had commanded the greatest naval victory of the century. Poets composed verses in his praise. Artists painted his portrait. Women throughout Christendom admired this handsome and victorious young warrior. He himself seemed destined for even greater things, perhaps indeed the conquest of Constantinople that so many dreamed of. But history, as often happens, took a different path than expected. The Holy League, created with so much effort before the battle, began to fall apart almost immediately afterward. The old rivalries between Venice and Spain came back. Each power had its own priorities and agendas. Venice, exhausted by the war and eager to regain its trade routes, soon negotiated a separate peace with the Ottomans. Spain, increasingly concerned about rebellions in the Netherlands and tensions with England, sent its resources elsewhere. Don Juan never had the opportunity to build on his victory. He was sent to rule the Spanish Netherlands, where he fought Dutch rebels in a frustrating and endless war. He died in 1578 at the age of 33 of typhoid fever in a cold, damp military tent far from the glory of Lepanto. His body was secretly transported back to Spain, dismembered and preserved in salt to prevent decomposition during the journey. It was a sad end for such a brilliant hero. And the Ottomans, they showed remarkable resilience. The Grand Vizier famously said, "You Christians have singed our beard, but it will grow back stronger. We have cut off your arm, and it will never grow back." He was referring to the loss of Cyprus, which remained in Ottoman hands, and there was truth in his words. In less than a year, Istanbul's shipyards had built a new fleet of over 200 galleys. Although they lost many experienced sailors at Lepanto, they had vast resources to recruit and train new ones. Yet something fundamental had changed. The Ottoman aura of invincibility had been shattered. It had been proven that they could be defeated, that their tactics could be overcome, that their empire was not the inevitable destiny many had begun to believe. This psychological shift was perhaps as important as the military victory itself. The Christian powers regained their confidence. The panic that had gripped coastal cities for generations began to fade. Most importantly, Lepanto marked the end of Ottoman expansion in the western Mediterranean. Although they held Cyprus and remained a powerful force for centuries, they never again seriously tried to invade Italy or threaten the heartland of Western Christendom. Their attention gradually turned to other frontiers: the Balkans, Persia, and the Caucasus. The galleasses, Lepanto's secret weapon, had an interesting fate. They represented the future of naval warfare, but a future that would take decades to fully realize. The problem was that they were a transitional solution. They were more powerful than traditional galleys, but still partially relied on oars for movement. They foreshadowed the ships of the line of the 18th century, the frigates and the warships powered entirely by sail and armed with banks of cannons. But this complete transformation would take generations. In the short term, traditional galleys continued to dominate the Mediterranean for another century. Galleasses were expensive to build and maintain, required specialized crews, and were less versatile than ordinary galleys. So while their contribution at Lepanto was crucial, they did not immediately replace the existing fleets. Instead, they served as a sign, an indication of future direction. The true revolution in naval warfare would come with the development of line-of-battle tactics, where heavily armed sailing ships would sail in parallel formations, exchanging artillery salvos until one side or the other was destroyed. This was the type of naval warfare that Nelson would master at Trafalgar more than 2 centuries later. But the seeds of this revolution were planted at Lepanto, where for the first time the power of naval artillery was decisively demonstrated. There are deep lessons in the story of Lepanto that echo through the centuries. The first is about the power of technological innovation. The Ottomans had numerical superiority, a winning tradition, and confidence born of decades of victories. But faced with a new technology they had not expected, and for which they were unprepared, their advantage disappeared. The galleasses changed the rules of the game, and changed them in ways that the Ottomans could not adapt to quickly enough. The second lesson concerns the importance of unity in the face of an existential threat. The Holy League was an unlikely alliance of states that were normally rivals or even enemies. Venice and Spain had competed for trade and influence for decades. The Papal States had their own agendas. Genoa competed with Venice, but in the face of the Ottoman threat, these differences were temporarily set aside. This unity, so difficult to achieve and so fragile to maintain, was crucial to victory. The third lesson is about leadership. Don Juan of Austria was only 24 when he commanded the Holy League fleet. He was young, relatively inexperienced in naval warfare, and commanded admirals much older and more experienced than himself. But he possessed charisma, courage, and the ability to inspire men to give their best. His decision to place galleasses at the front of the formation, though controversial at the time, proved brilliant. Good leadership can multiply the effectiveness of any force. The fourth lesson concerns the persistence of unintended consequences. Lepanto was hailed as a crushing victory that would change the course of history, and in a sense it did, but not in the way people at the time expected. It did not lead to the reconquest of Constantinople. It did not destroy Ottoman power. It did not unite Christendom in a permanent crusade. Instead, its consequences were more subtle and long-term, a shift in the psychological balance of power, an acceleration in naval innovation, a precedent for European cooperation against common threats. Miguel de Cervantes, the young Spanish soldier who fought at Lepanto despite illness, would later write about the battle with pride in the prologue to Don Quixote. He called Lepanto the highest occasion the ages have seen. For him and thousands of others who fought there, it was the defining moment of their lives. They had been present at a turning point in history. They had participated in something truly epic. And indeed, there is something epic about Lepanto that goes beyond the battle itself. It was the last great galley engagement in the Mediterranean, the end of an era of naval warfare that stretched back to ancient times. The tactics Themistocles used at Salamis, the Romans used against Carthage, the Byzantines used against the Arabs, all culminated and ended at Lepanto. After that, a new era of naval warfare of ships of the line and heavy artillery of completely different tactics would come. But now, on that October afternoon in 1571, as the sun set over blood-stained waters and wreckage drifted ashore, men on both sides understood they had participated in something extraordinary. They had witnessed the clash of empires, the clash of civilizations, and the triumph of innovation over tradition. The secret weapon that destroyed the Ottoman Navy wasn't just the 6 Venetian galleasses, though their contribution was crucial. It was the idea they represented, that warfare was changing, that artillery and technology were becoming more important than brute courage and traditional tactics, that the future belonged to those who could innovate faster than their enemies. This lesson would echo through the following centuries. When the Spanish faced the English Armada in 1588, they discovered that the English had learned the lessons of Lepanto better than they had. The English ships, more maneuverable and with better artillery, destroyed the Spanish fleet, preventing the close encounters the Spanish had expected. It was Lepanto, on a grander scale and in its purest form. When Nelson defeated the French and Spanish fleets at Trafalgar in 1805, he was using principles that dated back to Lepanto: superior artillery, innovative formations, and the courage to break with conventional tactics. When steam-powered warships replaced sailing ships in the 19th century, when torpedoes and submarines revolutionized naval warfare in the 20th century, when aircraft carriers became decisive in World War II, each of these revolutions echoed the fundamental principle demonstrated at Lepanto: technological innovation can overcome numerical and traditional advantages. Today, more than 450 years after Lepanto, we live in a world shaped in part by that distant confrontation. The balance between Europe and the Ottoman Empire that emerged after Lepanto influenced centuries of later history. The European confidence restored by victory contributed to the age of exploration and later European world domination. The Ottomans, though they remained powerful for centuries, were never again able to seriously threaten Western Europe. The very galleys and galleasses that fought at Lepanto have long since decayed into dust. The men who crewed them are centuries dead. The empires they fought for have transformed beyond recognition or disappeared altogether. The Ottoman Empire, which seemed so formidable in 1571, finally collapsed after the First World War, breaking into dozens of modern nation-states. Spain, which provided the core of the Christian fleet, long ago lost its global empire. Venice, the trading republic that built the revolutionary galleasses, is now a museum city, its naval glory merely memories preserved in palaces and paintings. But Lepanto's fundamental lesson remains relevant. Traditional advantages can be overcome by innovation. Enemies that seem unbeatable can be defeated. Technological changes can shift the balance of power faster than anyone expects. And in moments of existential crisis, even bitter rivals can find ways to cooperate for mutual benefit. The secret weapon that destroyed the Ottoman Navy at Lepanto wasn't just a machine or a tactic. It was the willingness to think differently, to challenge convention, to risk innovation against tradition. It was the recognition that the world was changing, and that those who failed to change with it would be left behind. It was the courage to invest in new technologies even when their effectiveness was unproven. It was the vision to see beyond the limitations of the present to the possibilities of the future. On that October day in 1571 in the Gulf of Patras, more than just one battle was decided. The future of naval warfare was transformed. The balance between Europe and Asia was shifted, and a lesson was taught that would echo through the centuries. Innovation, leadership, and unity can overcome even the most challenging obstacles. When we look back through the lens of history to that distant day, we see not just a battle, but a moment of transformation. We see the end of one era and the beginning of another. We see courage and sacrifice, genius and error, triumph and tragedy. We see humanity at its most intense, fighting not just for territory or power, but for fundamental visions of how the world should be. And at the center of it all, we see those 6 Venetian galleasses, massive and revolutionary, their rows of cannons spewing fire and death, breaking formations that had remained unchanged for centuries, proving that the future always belongs to those brave enough to embrace change. This is the story of the Battle of Lepanto and the secret weapon that destroyed the Ottoman Navy. It is a story of innovation over tradition, of courage over numbers, of vision over complacency, It is a story that reminds us that no advantage is permanent, no empire eternal, and that the only constant in history is change. And it is a story that teaches us that those who shape the future are those willing to risk the present in the name of a new vision. The waves that crashed onto the shores of the Gulf of Patras that day are long gone, but their echoes ring through the centuries, reminding us that moments of transformation are possible, that history can change in a single day, and that what seemed impossible in the morning can become reality at sunset. For those who fought that day, however, there was an additional dimension to their victory. Don Juan of Austria, by raising the crucifix on the mast of his galley before battle, acknowledged something his men deeply understood, that they fought not only with strategy and weapons, but with faith. When the Christian soldiers prayed on the decks before the clash, when the priests offered final absolution, when Pope Pius V fell to his knees upon hearing news of the victory, they all recognized a fundamental truth of their time and their beliefs. The victory at Lepanto was attributed not only to military genius or technological superiority, but to divine providence. The Christian commanders believed that the Lord God had guided their hands, strengthened their hearts, and blessed their weapons. This faith, this absolute conviction that they were fighting for something greater than themselves, gave them a strength that went beyond the merely material. It was a strength that came from certainty of purpose, from unity around shared values, from the belief that they were serving a just cause under the eyes of the Lord God. Whatever our modern perspective on those distant events, we cannot fully understand Lepanto without acknowledging this spiritual dimension. For the men who fought and died that day, for the families who prayed for their safety, for the cities that celebrated the victory with religious processions, Lepanto was more than a naval battle. It was a moment when they believed that the Lord God had intervened in human history, protecting Christianity from an existential threat. This is the timeless lesson of Lepanto, preserved forever in the memory of humanity, that courage, innovation, and faith can together overcome even the most impossible obstacles.